Good evening. Such a pleasure to be a part of this important conference and to be able to celebrate the life and legacy of our beloved Shahrnush Parsipur. My journey as an artist began with the obsession with Persian literature, primarily with the works of modern and contemporary Iranian women, writers, poets, and novelists. In fact, my very first body of work, created in 1993, became a series of self-portrait photographs unveiling a later woman of Allah, in which I inscribed poetry primarily by Forough Farrokhzad and Tahir Safarzadeh on the surface. These poems didn't simply become an accompaniment to the images, but they inspired and shaped the very meaning of the images. And from that point on, calligraphy and text have become very central to my photographic practice. As I moved on to the moving picture, made video installations and cinema, my literary interest now expanded beyond poetry to novels by Iranian women writers. I began to study writers such as Shirin Neshat, Goli Taraqi, Moniru Rabanipour, and eventually Shahrnush Parsipur. I have to say that I have gravitated toward women writers such as Forough and Shahrnush, not only because of their magnificent literature, which were radical, profound, courageous, and utterly original in their culture and beyond, but because of who they were as women and the challenging lives that they lived, in a way that no one could separate their personal lives from their writings. They both lived intense and painful lives. They were often socially isolated and outcast. Shahrnush was imprisoned, forced to a life in exile, suffered from poverty and illness, while Foroug's young life was interrupted by a tragic accident. What they also had in common was perhaps how they both had to sacrifice traditional female life and motherhood and devoted themselves to their writings until they no longer could. I've come to realize that my obsession with these iconic women writers and their trajectory as artists was a way to confront my own struggles as a smaller Iranian artist as I continue to search for my own identity. Sadly, up until I met Shahrnush, I never had the opportunity to get to know any of my favorite women writers personally. Most of them were either no longer alive or I had no access to. But everything changed in the year 2000 when I encountered my friend Hamid Dabashi, the scholar and professor at Columbia University, who recommended me to read Woman Without Men by Shahrnush Parsipur. After I read this book, I immediately was convinced this was the right novel to readapt into my first feature film because of the extraordinary way this book paralleled my own visual and conceptual sensibilities. Women Without Men ultimately existed between every kind of dualities. Heaven and earth, magic and realism, the believable and the unbelievable, nature and culture, history and mysticism, the political and the poetic. The more I studied the novel, the more I admired the way Shahrnush had so carefully shaped each character. Some of the women were entirely magical and surreal, while some of them were grounded fully in reality. Most importantly, how each of the ladies represented a different layer and facet of the Iranian society at the time. Zarin Kola, for example, came from an impoverished background, a prostitute slaved by the brothel. She gradually loses her mind. But to me, she was always the most mystical and heartbreaking character in both the novel and the film. Munes came from a conservative, middle-class religious family. Her only dream was to fight for political justice, but her domineering brother refused to let her participate in public life. She chooses death, and only through death she is able to be free and finally be able to join the political struggle. Faize, on the other hand, who also comes from a middle-class religious family, only desires nothing more than an ordinary life, marriage and children and a family. But after she's raped, those dreams are completely shattered forever. Finally, there's Farokh Ligha, a wealthy woman in her 50s who still longs to reinvent herself. She leaves her unhappy marriage and buys an orchard in Karaj, hoping to begin life over again, to become an artist, to gather intellectuals, and to create a cultural salon. For me, I found the orchard in Karaj a powerful symbol which went back to Persian mythology and literature, as it represented the space of paradise, spirituality, sanctuary, freedom, and independence, a place where the women were given a second chance to start life over again. And the only positive character, ironically, was the gardener, whose mysterious and mystical nature reflected the qualities of the garden itself. After discovering Woman Without Men in year 2000, I tried to find Shahrnush. I learned that she lived in suburbs of Northern California. I tracked her down. I flew to California. We had an unusual character encounter, and I immediately fell in love with her. I asked if she would entrust me with the film rights to her novel, and she said yes. Soon after, Shahrnush moved to New York and gradually became a part of my family. From then on, our lives became deeply intertwined in this commitment to turn her book into a movie. Together, we traveled to Morocco several times, first to shoot a video of Mahdouth in year 2000, a video of Zayn Kola in year 2005, and eventually in 2007 to complete the feature-length film. From the start, Shahrnush gave me and Shoja Azari her blessing and the confidence to make several important changes. We removed Mahdouth from the central narrative because her character was simply too magical for the screen, and we brought the 1953 coup to the forefront of the story, the overthrow of Dr. Mossadegh's regime and the restoration of the Shah's government. We spent 6 years writing and rewriting the screenplay, adapting what is perhaps one of the most difficult literary forms to translate into cinema, magic realism. We shot the film in Morocco, finally in 2000, and it was released in 2009. I always felt that Shahrnush and I shared something fundamental. Unlike what most people think, neither one of us was political or a feminist. We were both simply poets. We were drawn to mysticism, power of dreams, and the invisible dimension of human experience, but always with an eye on reality. What I personally loved about Woman Without Men was how it created a beautiful and poetic parallel between Tehran and the orchard in Karaj. The orchard was a clear metaphor representing the soul, the philosophical core of the story, exploring the inner emotional state of the female characters, while the city of Tehran representing the reality, the external world, politics, and history. And most beautiful for me was how the plight of the women characters in the film, in the story, as they search for freedom and independence, paralleled with the country of Iran as they too struggled for and fought for an idea of freedom and democracy and foreign intervention. Ultimately, Woman Without Men, through its profound sensitivity to human fragility, brings together history, politics, feminism, mysticism, and poetry. A really delicate balance that I've always dreamed creating in my own work, where I can manage to speak of socio-political realities without sacrificing ambiguity, beauty, and poetry. Losing Shahrnush Parsipur has been a profound loss for me. She has not only been one of my dearest friends, she has been a family. She was my mentor, my teacher, and the only Iranian novelist with whom I was fortunate enough to develop such a close and lasting relationship with. As I said earlier, she endured many hardships throughout her life, yet she was never bitter. She and I often spoke about how we both created women characters that embodied our own nature and characters, our own wounds, pains, vulnerabilities, rage, yet hopes, dreams, strengths, courage, and imagination. Shahrnush lived primarily in the realm of imagination, yet she understood reality more profoundly than most people I know. She was one of a kind. I doubt I will ever encounter another human being as original and radical, as authentic as Shahrnush Parsipur. I will miss her terribly.